Channel 4 have just released their Big British Beef Battle documentary, and British livestock farmers are wrongly under attack. The documentary looks at the impact that beef production has on climate change and makes the argument that we should be reducing our beef intake to protect the planet. The problem is that the documentary is filled with inaccuracies and uses very misleading claims that wrongly demonise livestock farmers here in the UK. And it needs to stop, because it is utter bullshit. So I've made this video to give you the real story behind the data used in the documentary and give you a more accurate insight into livestock production here in the UK. I'm here to tell you that British farmers are part of the climate solution, not the problem. But before we start, let's clear a couple of things up. Firstly, I'm a believer in climate change and that it is 100% man-made and not some natural phenomenon. So climate deniers, you can go somewhere else, said politely. And I also fundamentally believe that it poses an existential threat to this planet and we need to do whatever we can to try and solve it. Secondly, I believe that there is no industry on the planet that does not need to reduce its carbon footprint, and agriculture is no different. I'm not here to argue that agriculture is perfect, because it's not, but we are making huge leaps towards our carbon emissions targets. And thirdly, I actually really quite enjoy Channel 4 documentaries. I like the way that they tackle difficult subjects and tend to be more edgy than some of the other media outlets. Like always, the Big British Beef Battle told a compelling story, but it's just a shame that it was very one-sided and used very inaccurate figures to tell that story. So with that out the way, let's get stuck in. One of the main issues is that the documentary uses global emissions figures for a documentary entitled The Great British Beef Battle. Not only is that inaccurate, but it is hugely misleading. We heard claims that beef has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of food produced, and that the vast majority of cattle are fed on grain, corn and soya, and that 80% of deforestation is due to cattle. And whilst I'm not going to disagree with those numbers on a global level, none of them are applicable or relate to livestock farming here in the UK. When we look at the global data, 23% of the CO2 produced is due to land use change, which again doesn't apply here in the UK. The nature of the topography and the climate that we have here in this country means that the land is very well suited to livestock production. In fact, 65% of the agricultural land here in the UK is best suited for grass and livestock farming. What these global figures largely represent is the land change use that we see in places like Brazil with the felling of trees to create pastures on which to rear cattle, or the intensive factory farming practices that we see in places like America. I and the vast majority of farmers in the UK have an issue with those. But those practices don't happen in the UK and are not applicable to livestock production in this country. When we look at the data produced by the AHDB for here in England, the average greenhouse gas emissions for cattle produced in the UK is around 23 grams per kilo. So that's 75% less than the global average. And within that figure there is a banding of which at the lower end it is 5.6 grams per kilo. So when we take that figure back to the global emissions graph that was used in the documentary, that puts British beef production on a par with olive oil. And there's a hell of a lot more nutritional value in a kilo of beef than there is in a kilo of olive oil. So if you really want to help the environment, this further emphasises the importance of buying British and buying local. I sincerely wish the documentary makers would use the data for British farming, particularly for a documentary entitled The Big British Beef Battle. Which brings me to my second point, and that is the biogenic carbon cycle. That's a complex name for what is a relatively simple but hugely overlooked concept that addresses the concerns with the amount of methane that is produced by cattle. A lot of the data used in this documentary and by the media in general fail to account for the source of the carbon being emitted. With livestock production here in the UK and with all ruminants, there is a natural carbon cycle that takes place. Grassland is a huge carbon sink. It soaks up carbon from the environment in the same way that trees or hedgerows do. Cows and ruminants eat that grass and use it to grow, but methane is released as a byproduct through cattle belching or farting. But that's just part of the natural cycle. That methane in the atmosphere is then oxidised into carbon dioxide after about 10 to 12 years, and that carbon dioxide is then reabsorbed into the grass through photosynthesis. So we have this natural carbon cycle which, as long as we don't overgraze, can continue indefinitely. When you look at fossil fuels or transport by comparison, then there's a huge amount of greenhouse gases and carbon being emitted, but there is nothing being sequestered. And it is these emissions which are causing an imbalance of carbon in the atmosphere, which is driving climate change. We heard in the documentary that one of the biggest impacts that people can make in helping the environment is to reduce the red meat intake. But I'd argue that a bigger impact would be reducing fossil fuel use through transportation or reducing consumerism. Which brings me on to point number 3, which is carbon tunnel vision. The only leg that these anti-meat campaigners can really stand on, pun intended, is that of carbon emissions. And whilst everyone is so focused on the carbon emissions of cattle, they lose sight or fail to mention all the beneficial impacts that cattle and ruminants have on the environment. Things such as the beneficial impact on soil health, on watercourses, on biodiversity, and regional economies, to name but a few, are all hugely important to establishing whether or not red meat is damaging the environment. The World Health Organization released a report highlighting the 5 biggest carbon sinks in the world. Grasslands were at number 5, and herbivores and ruminants were seen as vital to the enhancement of these carbon sinks as they increase the speed at which carbon is absorbed back into the grasslands. It is so incredibly infuriating that the documentary was so one-sided and failed to mention any of these benefits. So what can we do? Well, whatever way you cut it, documentaries like this are damaging to the farming industry and go some way in shaping people's perceptions of red meat and livestock production in this country. But to take some amount of positivity out of it, I do believe it provides a platform and should be a wake-up call to the industry to project our side of the story and shout about all the great stuff that we're doing here in the UK. We should be incredibly proud of our livestock farming and what we produce in this country. Not only is it a great source of nutrient-dense food, but it is also done in a sustainable way. Livestock farming in this country should not be demonised, and it should not be a source of shame. We should be reminding consumers that British farming is part of the climate solution, not the problem. We should be proud of that, and we should not be scared to shout about it.